I saw an Instagram post by Brené Brown, who describes herself as a researcher and a storyteller. And she is famous for her study around courage, vulnerability, shame, and empathy. And I'm pretty sure some of you already know about her pretty well. Brené Brown. The Instagram post was a photo of her sitting down with a notebook open and a pen in her hand, and she's thinking in this thinking bubble. Before I start writing, I need a new laptop, and I need to paint the study a more creative color, and I need a ton of office supplies. I mean, 4,572 post-it notes and some colored markers and new highlighters. That was the post. And I was thinking, this is so me. Pretty much every time I sit down to do something or anything. So I had to look closer to what it was all about. And it was a promotion to her latest podcast with Professor Scott Sonnenschein, about his latest book called Stretch. And after listening to that podcast, I thought what they were talking about would be a good framework to how we reflect on the biblical scene of the parting of the Red Sea, especially in the context of the world we live in today. So let me share what I learned from the podcast. So in the book, Stretch, the author, Sonnenschein, talks about the difference between stretching and chasing. So by stretching, the author means to be resourceful, to be more creative with what you already have. On the other hand, he defines chasing as the culture itself that says the more we have, we can do more. That culture in general, he calls chasing. If we can have more time or more money, we could do more. And there was a time that this was true, when more we had was the token to success. This model works when there is a constant income of resources. So that is the condition of this chasing model, when we can have that consistent, constant income of resources. And then when that wasn't true anymore, people started to ask themselves, what are we doing now? What are we doing? And it's not an either or situation here. Everyone does both stretching and catching. What the author believes is that having these vocabularies of stretching and catching will allow us to keep ourselves accountable. So in this podcast, and I think it's in the book also, he talks about an interesting illustration which he called the frying pan test. The frying pan test. So what this test is basically is about is, if you give a child a frying pan, the frying pan can turn into a toy, and it can become a weapon in their play, or it can be a musical instrument to make a rhythmic sound, or to drive their parents crazy. However, for an adult, the frying pan is, and here he uses term culturated. Because we are culturated, we can only view frying pan as an adult only for cooking. What this culturation does is that it takes away all the untapped possibility. So when we're chasing, we miss out all the untapped possibilities. The dilemma is that the more we get stabilized and get systemized, our stretchiness decreases. meaning that our ability to do more creatively with what we already have, it fades. So that's the dilemma. So by this point of the podcast, the nodding of my head in agreement was at its climax because all of these was so true. I remember how I was living my life when my immigration status was not promising any long-term stability. I remembered how I was just anxiously waiting for that phone call from a district superintendent or the bishop if there was any church opening for me available. Yes, it is important for us to become an expert in what we're doing. But in the meantime, it is important for us to remain open to the untapped possibilities. It is important for us to keep our imagination open to how to use the frying pan other than for cooking. So the one takeaway that I got from this podcast was how aware are we? How aware are we of that moment when we put ourselves into a box? How aware are we of that moment when we put ourselves into a box? Especially if you are a person like me who values stability over risk taking, it requires an extra intentionality to keep ourselves accountable to the question if we are stretching or chasing. Now, the reason I took the time to share the summary of the pocket was because as I was hearing this insightful knowledge towards personal development, in the back of my mind, I couldn't erase the question, how can we expand this in a more of a communal sense? What if we can apply these vocabularies beyond the personal level? Today, we're continuing our journey with the Israelites through the wilderness. Last week, we imagined together upon the emotions of that Passover night. And after the night, Pharaoh lets the Israelites go, and off they go into the wilderness. However, Pharaoh changes his mind and begins to chase after the Israelites. And that's how we are led into today's portion of the reading, which we are so familiar with, the parting of the Red Sea or the Reed Sea, whichever way you want to interpret it, where the bad guys, the Egyptians, were all swallowed at the bottom of the water, and the good guys, by God's help, were safely on the other side of this judgment. As I was studying and reflecting on this common story, familiar story, I was amazed by two things. How deeply amazing the scripture is, the ever-living word that provides direction to every moment of human history, and even again to us as we reflect on the couple of thousands years old story in the context of this year, 2020. So that was the first amazing thing, how that scripture is ever living. And the second thing that I was amazed about is how easily it is for me to put myself into a box when I read the scripture, especially when the story is so familiar to us in the form of a movie or in a form of a cartoon or as one of the Vacation Bible School activities. This time, as I was studying this text, it got across to me when we think about the individual soldiers in that Egyptian army that day. To be more exact, in verse 7 of this chapter, chapter 14, it says that Pharaoh took 600 of the best chariots, along with all the chariots of Egypt, with officers all over them. 600 plus officers and horses. Did they deserve this death? I never thought about that. But did they deserve this death? Pharaoh is the one who's responsible, right? All they did was to practice. All the soldiers was to practice their allegiance to their nation and to the system they believed in and lived in. And we're not even sure if Pharaoh himself died that day, right? Some commentators argue that the thing that is more important than the innocence of an individual relationship with the larger group is what that larger group represents. In this case, in our scriptural case, the Egyptians represented oppression, abuse of power, policies of enslavement, and domination. That's what Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians, were represented by. In this story, at least. The question to us is to look at the groups that we are part of, or the groups that identifies us. What do those groups represent? The political party that we are voting for? What does that group represent? The color of our skin. What does that represent in our society today? Or the kind of neighborhood that we live in? What does that represent? Or the schools or the districts that we live in? What does that represent? If I am part of a group who can continue to work by working remotely without having to lose our jobs, what does that represent? The big question that we join the Egyptian soldiers in terms of stretching and chasing is, what are we chasing after? What are we chasing after? Something to think about as we live in this time when we had to change the way we do everything, almost everything. There was an insight during our weekly district clergy gathering that during the earlier month of this pandemic, we were running off from our adrenaline. I may have mentioned this to you before, but we were running off from our adrenaline earlier during this pandemic. And then by early summer, we were burning out. We were being zoomed out, right? And then as the new school year begins, after the summer, we are picking up, it seems like at least, we are picking up that energy again. And I realized that during these past months, at least from my personal point of view, I was chasing after something that we did not have, or something we once had, but not anymore. And by constantly spending our energy in chasing, we hit the wall of asking ourselves, wait, what are we doing now? What are we doing now? Spending hours and hours on YouTube tutorials to figure out how to best do church online and virtually, to a point where I hit the wall. that wall of hoping that if I had someone knowledgeable with technology in the congregation who knew how to operate all these programs, who can come and help me, right? Hoping that if we had a budget to install a multiple camera system and better sound system so that we can have a better quality on your screen as you worship this morning. I guess learning and improving through those YouTube tutorials and webinars is one thing, but feeling discouraged about what we don't have or the version of the production we can't produce, that is another thing, right? And then we see Moses. Moses standing by himself with God before the vast body of water. At the most anxious time, as the roar of the Pharaoh's army is at the horizon, with the overwhelming pressure of being the point person to decide and to figure this situation out for the people, he stretches out his hand over the sea. That's all he did. He stretches out his hands over the sea. He didn't search YouTube tutorial to do it yourself, build a large boat from scratch, how to build a large boat from scratch. He didn't go on a webinar to how to effectively train a military system and make weapons in a short period of time. He didn't do that without doubting what his hands are capable of. More importantly, without doubting what God is capable of. All he did was to stretch what he had. His arms, his hands, and most importantly, his faith. This week, the scripture gave me a great sense of insight, personally. So instead of sighing over the things we don't have in terms of church, I realized that I need to pay more attention to what we have as a pastor. I need to pay more attention to what we have. Pay more attention to the amazing people of Trinity United Methodist Church than paying too much attention, spending a lot of hours on the YouTube tutorials. The experience that we have in our congregation, the gifts that we have in our congregation, even those things, those gifts that we don't even know that we have already. And I'm kind of excited to see the many possibilities of how we can use the frying pan in a new way by stretching our hands over the sea. And as we do more stretching over chasing, let us remember two things. One, you already have enough. You already have everything you need to get through that water. You are enough. Your loved ones, your children, they are enough. We, as the church, are enough. All we need is to stretch our personal boundaries. That's all we need to do. And the second thing for us to remember is that Moses wasn't alone. All along, the angel of God was guarding in the front and from behind. And I pray that each of us will remember that God who leads and protects and watches over us is always with us, with you, and with our loved ones. Whichever wilderness we are walking this week, individually and together. So let us remember those two things as we close our worship today. Remember one thing: you are enough. And number two, God